Even before the Sega Saturn was released, there were those that believed that Sega had made a very big mistake with its design. Early screens of games like Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA had raised questions about the polygon processing power of the unit and its ease of development. When it finally did release, it was apparent that all was not well, with even Sega struggling to make its games look great. As time went on, things improved mightily, but there were still developers, Sega among them, that struggled to make three-dimensional games. In this episode, we will be taking a look at some of the uglier games for the Sega Saturn. I have a great mix of driving, sports, and action adventures. It's important to note that I am focusing solely on these games from a visual standpoint. Some of these are actually decent and well worth playing, but they sure as heck were tough on the eyes. I hope you guys enjoy ugly Sega Saturn games. I happen to enjoy a good baseball game every now and then, but man, is Bases Loaded 96 one hell of a bad looking title. Things start out pretty rough. The batter's view uses pre-rendered sprites for the players that look strange, but it's really the field and stadium where things fall apart. There is a weird flatness to it that is really off-putting. I mean, look at this. How did the developers think that this was a good look for their game? The strangeness continues too. Sometimes it looks like the wall is raised above the crowd behind it. Just how are these folks supposed to see the game exactly? The outfield is also marred by extremely pixelated sprites and some pretty vicious aliasing issues. The lone bright spot here is the smooth camera and the solid animation, but otherwise this is a strange engine that just looks all wrong. It doesn't help that the gameplay is kinda crappy either. Hits into the outfield are so hard to recover in a timely manner that scores can mount into the double digits regularly. This one was done by Jellicoe and was early in the system's life. I can't forgive it though, because Sega's World Series Baseball absolutely destroys it and was released around the same time.
Fair ball. Fair ball. Out.
Time Warner's 1995 port of Race Driving was another one that had me scratching my head. While the flat shaded stuff is fairly unimpressive itself, it's the new texture mapped mode that really blew me away. Take a look at this travesty. Holy hell, man. Those are some of the ugliest textures I have ever seen in my life. And the constant texture warping, glitching, and pop-in are god tier among bad looking games. And dude, when I say it's bad, it's really bad. Sometimes the geometry is so late coming in, it actually pops up on the side of the road as you pass it by. No joke. Usually I applaud extra modes and features, but this is one case where the game would have been better off without it. Garbage like this makes Jaguar games look next generation. Time Warner should be absolutely ashamed of themselves. So bad was it, no one wanted to release it outside of Japan. Sometimes a game is ugly and it runs like complete shit, exacerbating its problems. That describes 1996 Alone in the Dark 2 perfectly. This was licensed for release by Cocopelli, who had a small firm named In Utero develop it. I don't know much about them, but it's clear as day they had no idea how to use the Saturn's hardware. I mean, look at this. While Alone in the Dark 2 was always a title with low polygon counts, the performance of the Saturn makes every facet of this game worse. It's a damn slideshow most of the time and borders on unplayable. When the camera switches, it takes ages for the next scene to pop up, leaving you at the mercy of enemies and their weapons. I typically can't play this turd for more than a few minutes before I give up in disgust. Considering Resident Evil runs and looks so much better on the Saturn, this older game has zero credible excuses for how it performs. If you want a better version, stick with the PC and 3DO versions. Old Crypt Killer here gets a lot of hate. I happen to think it plays great though, particularly its 2-player mode. But you know what? There is no denying it's a rough looking game. In terms of polygon counts and textures, you won't find many Saturn games worse. To add insult to injury, it's also a fair bit uglier than the PlayStation version, which wasn't pretty to begin with. Believe it or not, this was produced by Konami and a port of an arcade game of the same name. Their A-team was definitely absent the day this one started development though. Massive amounts of pixelation on the textures and sprites absolutely destroy this game's presentation. If you thought the House of the Dead port was bad, fire this one up and have a gander at just how much worse it could have been. The Japanese could make some wacky games, no doubt about that, but I'm not really sure just what the hell Sega was thinking with funky head boxers. I mean, the idea of a bigger head to exaggerate facial expressions could have been done so much better. Here they blow the heads up so large, they need to be made transparent in order to see all the action. And you know what the Saturn has trouble with? Polygonal transparencies. That means the developers just applied a mesh to the heads and the results are point blank laughable. This was minimized a bit with a CRT with composite video, but on anything S-Video or better, it's an absolute mess. Bad transparency aside, the rest of the visuals are unimpressive as well. Flat backgrounds are joined by mannequin-style models that just aren't appealing. The original STV Titan arcade version was developed by Sega AM3 if you can believe it, and it was not one of their best showings. This was only released in Japan. Blackfire was the type of Sega of America product that I feel really hurt the Saturn's image in North America. Developed by Nova Logic and Sega Away Team, it wasn't tied to anything from Sega previously, and it was a game that really made the hardware look bad. Those 3D environments would have been called poor on the 3DO and Jaguar in 1993, so seeing them on a $400 Sega product in 1995 was just laughable. Virtually no detail exists, just some random colored textures and enemy vehicles. When you do come across a building, there is almost no detail on it and it sits in the middle of nowhere. Add in some fake transparent explosions and draw distance that isn't too impressive, and you have yet another ugly Saturn game that failed to live up to its billing. And let's be real here for a moment. Let's set aside our love of the machine and Sega and look at the time period without rose-tinted nostalgia. This pathetic excuse of a game was released a mere month before Warhawk for the Sony PlayStation. Think about that for a moment. You want to know why the Saturn was trounced in the United States? Because Sega was paying developers to make wastes of space like this instead of the titles people really wanted.
Impact target hit.
There were a fair number of PC ports to the Saturn in its day. Most of them suffered in the graphics department to some extent, but few turned out as bad as High Octane. This was a combat hovercar racing game in the same vein as titles like Wipeout. The similarities in there, however. This atrocious conversion has pop-in that appears right in front of you, performance that spikes up and down constantly, and some truly abysmal texture work. Unfortunately for the Saturn, this had the unenviable honor of being released right on top of Wipeout for the PlayStation. So while the latter received heaps of praise, High Octane was slaughtered in magazine reviews. The Saturn would eventually see a port of Wipeout to call its own, and while it had its issues, it was certainly better than this ugly, poor-running crap fest. I paid $50 for NFL 97 when it was released in November of 1996. I was expecting Sega Sports excellence, similar to what I had gotten on the Genesis, but instead Sega ripped me off with a terrible game that belittled the entire brand. For that, this game will forever get my hate. Whenever a bad game episode comes up, I find a way to include it. Fortunately, I didn't have to do much to include it here because besides being a terrible playing game of football, it's ugly as hell too. Players with disproportionate bodies, details on the field that draw in as you move, and just laughable assets all around. There is also a throwing assist that tracks the path of the ball, and it's an ugly mesh semi-transparent eyesore. Not that it matters because the passing game is so broken, you rarely have any real success anyway. This game looks like shit, plays worse, and Sega still owes me $50 for suffering its existence. At the end of 1995, Sega really turned things around with Saturn visuals. We had jumped from a disappointing Daytona USA to a killer Sega Rally Championship. Could they do it again? No, they couldn't. While Sega Rally had made major strides with 3D performance and geometry draw distance, Sega Touring Car is a step back in almost every category. The frame rate is all over the place and the textures are terrible. While the gameplay is subject to many different opinions, I think most of us can agree that after Sega Rally, this was a huge letdown visually. With 1997 coming to a close, the platform had classics like Wipeout XL showing up, and honestly, Sega releasing this just seemed like a waste of time. They already had better games with similar themes, and these resources were better served elsewhere. Sky Target was sort of Sega's 3D update to Afterburner. It was originally a Model 2 arcade title, and boy did it translate poorly to the Saturn. I don't really know where to begin. Shoddy textures and models, simple ground terrain that pops in right below you, and fake transparencies everywhere. It's just not a very good looking game. Hell, putting the sprite scaling original beside it kinda makes you wanna cry. In the plus column, however, the music is cheesy goodness, and the gameplay can still be a good time. It's no Afterburner climax, mind you, but for an early 3D arcade shooter, it plays well enough. Sega definitely needed a better graphics engine, however. This was 1997, and Saturn visuals were supposed to be shaping up, not regressing. Of course, the fact that Sega outsourced this to Appaloosa Interactive likely didn't help any. Most Sega properties done outside the company rarely turned out to be something worthy of the source material. In 1996, the Saturn got a conversion of Starfighter, a fully 3D combat flight simulator. Grab yourself a mission stick and the game is actually fun once you learn the mechanics. But you know what? It was a dreadful game graphically. There is not a single appealing feature here. Rough textures, poor models, bad performance, and a draw distance that had to be hidden by a fog layer that obscures the entire background. I first played this on the 3DO and it is improved somewhat in a few areas, but still isn't enough to call it impressive. It was the kind of thing where you'd think the developers could have really upgraded the assets to make it a much more impressive game visually, but that just wasn't the case here. It suffers many of the same problems that plagued other conversions like High Octane and Magic Carpet. Early 3D like this is an eyesore, despite gameplay that could be quite compelling. I love the look of Capcom's 2D fighters. I always thought the art and animation were top notch and they were some of my favorite games on the Saturn. But man, what the hell were they thinking when they did the graphics of Street Fighter the movie? While not a fan of digitized images myself, this still looks bad for that technology. Everything is washed out and the color is dark and dithered. There was also an arcade version of Street Fighter the movie that was radically different in gameplay, but shared similar visuals, and it blows this away and then some in that regard. I understand that Capcom may have been bitten by the success of Mortal Kombat and wanted to experiment, but man did they miss the mark with this one in regards to how it looks. This was a major step back from their beautifully drawn games before and after, and one that lives on in infamy. It's another one that plays well enough, but is completely overshadowed by its poor looks. I admire the design of Time Commando here. Using pre-rendered video and 3D models could make for a compelling engine, but here on the Saturn, it's just about as bad as they come for graphics. Terrible looking models, hilariously bad animation, and just an overall lack of cohesiveness to everything really make for an ugly game. Games like Resident Evil didn't suffer the same fate because that gameplay was designed around firearms, but here it is a heavy focus on melee attacks. If you want to try this, I highly recommend going elsewhere. This is another one where it was so bad on the Saturn, it was only released in Japan. And here's the kicker, it was 1998 when it was released. So while games like Burning Rangers, Panzer Dragoon Saga, and Shining Force 3 were being played, Acclaim had the balls to drop this at the same time. In the land of ugly games, there is a story of a title so hideous that it puts all others to shame. That game is Virtual Hydlide. Developed by T&E Soft and released in 1995, this is one of the most unimpressive games on the Saturn in regards to graphics. Let's break down what you are seeing. We have crappy digitized images, mixed with pixelated terrain, mixed with some truly eye-destroying performance that runs at a not-so-buttery 30 frames per minute. What that all adds up to is an adventure game that is basically built upon the developer's golf engine. Things go to complete hell once you go inside though. Just look at this, man. I can forgive a certain amount of jank in early games for the Saturn, but this is just too much. There is no way the developers honestly finished this up and said to themselves, "Job well done." I can imagine that celebration party was sitting around the office, sipping warm beer and eating cold pizza, wondering where the hell their next job was coming from. Surprisingly, T&E went on to do a few more golf games for the Saturn, all of them slideshows. Sega actually published this in Japan and Europe, with Atlas picking it up for the United States, making sure all of us were punished equally. There are some great looking games on the Saturn, games with textures and performance so smooth, you can't help but to love it. But as with every console out there, sometimes the stars align for some really bad stuff. Given the Saturn's rather peculiar architecture, it's no wonder why it's so easy to find games to fall into this category. The multi-processor design wasn't friendly to developers, nor was the way it rendered polygons. When the masters at Sega were struggling, that was cause for alarm, and many of their early titles definitely showed that the learning curve was gonna be a problem. Of course, you couple that with a developer that wasn't so great to begin with, and it could spawn some truly heinous results. While Sega's problems certainly went well beyond what made the Saturn tick, I think choosing that design certainly didn't help things. We can certainly appreciate its uniqueness nowadays, but back then, Sega definitely needed something a bit more developer-friendly. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.